Trump issued an executive order purporting to designate Antifa as a domestic terror organization, even though a senior FBI official struggled just last week in testimony in Congress to explain how Antifa is even an organization, after claiming without irony that it is the largest domestic threat facing the United States. More than 3,000 nonprofit groups have signed an open letter asserting that the National Security Presidential Memorandum on Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence is not about protecting Americans or defending the public interest. It's about using unchecked power to silence opposition and voices that the president disagrees with. To put it bluntly, the Trump Justice Department seeks to redefine any kind of political dissent against him as domestic terrorism. That is a classic Orwellian and authoritarian tactic that anybody who loves freedom should.
So let's be brutally clear about what you just witnessed, because this is not some abstract theoretical debate about civil liberties in a polite faculty lounge somewhere. This is the raw exposure of American fascism metastasizing in real time as we speak, and Jamie Raskin just handed us a devastating indictment that should make every single person who claims to care about freedom sit up and recognize the civilizational stakes of this moment, because the senior FBI official struggled just last week in testimony in Congress to explain how Antifa is even an organization, after claiming without irony that it is the largest domestic threat facing the United States. And if that doesn't send ice water through your veins, then you haven't been paying attention to how democracies die in the 21st century. Michael Glasheen was testifying before the House Committee on Homeland Security and told Democratic Representative Benny Thompson that after Antifa, a political designation and movement that stands for anti-fascism, was designated by President Trump as a domestic terrorist organization. That's our primary concern right now. And then when Thompson pressed him with the most basic imaginable question about where this supposedly terrifying organization is headquartered, Glasheen literally couldn't answer. He stumbled and fumbled and revealed the entire charade for what it actually is, which is a nakedly authoritarian effort to criminalize dissent itself, and we're about to unpack why this represents one of the most dangerous moments in American democratic history. But first you need to understand that this isn't happening in a vacuum. Trump issued an executive order in September 2025 designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, and the accompanying National Security Presidential Memorandum identifies anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality as the ideological markers of terrorism, which means if you oppose Trump's immigration policies, you're potentially a terrorist. If you support racial justice, you're potentially a terrorist. If you advocate for LGBTQ rights, you're potentially a terrorist. If you criticize American capitalism, question Christian nationalism, you're potentially a terrorist. And this is textbook authoritarianism, straight out of the playbook used by Erdogan in Turkey and Orbán in Hungary, and every two-bit dictator who ever wanted to consolidate power by painting opposition as existential threat. The Brennan Center's analysis is absolutely scathing here, because NSPM 7 directs federal agencies to prioritize investigations of a swath of identities and ideologies that it depicts as falling under the umbrella of self-described anti-fascism, including anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, race and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, which is so breathtakingly broad that it could encompass literally millions of Americans who hold perfectly legal progressive views. But here's where it gets even more chilling, and this is where Raskin's commentary becomes absolutely essential to understand, because more than 3,000 nonprofit groups have signed an open letter asserting that the National Security Presidential Memorandum on Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence is not about protecting Americans or defending the public interest. It's about using unchecked power to silence opposition and voices that the president disagrees with, and the Trump Justice Department seeks to redefine any kind of political dissent against him as domestic terrorism, which is a classic Orwellian and authoritarian tactic that anybody who loves freedom should reject. And when Raskin invokes Orwell, he's not being hyperbolic. He's being precisely accurate, because what we're witnessing is the literal redefinition of political speech as terrorism, which is exactly what Winston Smith's job was at the Ministry of Truth. Think about the operational mechanics of what Trump has unleashed here, because in the context of the vast anti-fascist conspiracy conjured up by NSPM 7, Investigators could abuse it to block the bank accounts and financial transactions of various organizations, merely because they stand in opposition to the administration, and administration and toffable putty and the SPOIT, both NSPM 7 and the ANTIFA executive order, take aim at the tax-exempt status of the foundations that fund civil society groups, as well as civil society groups themselves, directing the IRS commissioner to ensure that no tax-exempt entities are directly or indirectly financing political violence or domestic terrorism, which means the entire infrastructure of progressive organizing in America is now under direct assault from federal law enforcement acting on the president's personal political vendetta. Now let's talk about the testimonial disaster that just unfolded, because Thompson absolutely eviscerated this FBI official on the public record, and it's worth dwelling on the specifics because Thompson asked, "So what does that mean? You said Antifa is a terrorist organization. Tell us as a committee, how did you come to that? Where do they exist? How many members do they have in the United States as of right now?" And Glasheen couldn't offer anything concrete, saying that the answers to Thompson's questions are fluid, and that it was ongoing for us to understand that, the same no different than Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is absolutely jaw-dropping because he's comparing a decentralized ideological position to fascism, with hierarchical terrorist organizations that have command structures and training camps and literal armies, and the comparison is so facially absurd that it exposes the entire enterprise as performative authoritarianism. Thompson concluded, "Sir, you wouldn't come to this committee and say something you can't prove. I know you wouldn't do that, but you did, which is congressional understatement, for you just committed perjury in service of a fascist political agenda, and we all know it. The historical parallels here should terrify anyone who studied how authoritarian regimes consolidate power, because this is McCarthyism on steroids, turbocharged by 21st century surveillance technology and the full apparatus of the post-9/11 national security state, now turned inward against American citizens exercising their constitutional rights." The U.S. has never designated a domestic terrorist organization before, and there is no legal authority currently under federal law to make such a designation, and labeling political activity as terrorist activity could run the risk of infringing on Americans' First Amendment rights, and there is a real lack of clarity over this characterization of Antifa as a formal hierarchical organization, which means Trump is literally inventing extra-legal powers out of whole cloth and betting that the courts won't stop him fast enough to matter, and that the damage to civil society will already be done by the time any judicial remedy arrives. The Congressional Research Service has been crystal clear about this for years, stating domestic terrorism is not a chargeable federal offense, and while an individual may still have committed criminal acts that are widely considered domestic terrorism, the individual cannot be charged with committing an act of domestic terrorism under current federal law, which means the entire designation is legally meaningless, except as a propaganda tool and a pretext for surveillance and harassment. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and this is where we need to talk about the downstream operational consequences, because Attorney General Pam Bondi sent out a memo ordering the FBI to compile a list of groups or entities engaging in acts that may constitute domestic terrorism, and set a deadline for all law enforcement agencies to coordinate delivery of intelligence files related to Antifa or Antifa-related activities to the FBI, which means they're building databases of political dissidents right now as we speak. They're compiling lists of organizations and individuals and creating the infrastructure for mass repression, and if you think that's hyperbole, consider that the Trump administration is actively building profiles on American citizens by combining data traditionally siloed in separate agencies like tax returns, health records, any interactions with police with information purchased from tech companies, breaking down the few guardrails that still remained on privacy, enabling the executive branch to track the movements of dissenters, which is totalitarian surveillance state stuff that would make the Stasi jealous. The ideological targeting is so explicit it's almost comical, except that it's not funny at all, because movements portrayed as portraying foundational American principles like support for law enforcement and border control as fascist, to justify acts of violent revolution, and this anti-fascist lie has become the organizing rallying cry used by domestic terrorists to wage a violent assault against democratic institutions, constitutional rights, and fundamental American liberties, which is completely inverted Orwellian logic, where opposing actual authoritarian policies gets redefined as attacking democracy itself, and supporting brutal immigration enforcement and militarized policing gets redefined as defending American values, when in fact it's the exact opposite. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening here, because Trump is claiming that people who oppose his authoritarian policies are the real authoritarians, and people who call out fascism are the real fascists, and this is not a new tactic. This is literally what every fascist movement in history has done. They always claim to be the victims of the violence they themselves are perpetrating. Now let's talk about what makes this especially pernicious in the contemporary American context, because Representative Benny Thompson stated that designating Antifa, which has no defined organizational structure or leadership, as a domestic terrorism organization, is not only incorrect but serves no purpose other than an excuse for the Trump administration to stifle dissent, investigate anyone or any group they don't like, punish their enemies, and potentially label any American they want as a terrorist. And the real threat, according to government officials from both parties and all available data, is from right-wing violent extremism. And this is the crucial point that cannot be emphasized enough, because militant, nationalistic, white supremacist violent extremism has increased in the United States. The number of far-right attacks continues to outpace all other types of terrorism and domestic violent extremism, and since 1990, far-right extremists have committed far more ideologically motivated homicides than far-left or radical Islamist extremists, including 227 events that took more than 520 lives, according to actual data from terrorism researchers who aren't politically motivated hacks. So Trump is designating the ideological opposition to the actual terrorist threat as itself, the terrorist threat, which is like putting the fire department on trial for arson, while the arsonists run free, and this inversion of reality is a core feature of fascist politics, not a bug. The Department of Homeland Security just a couple of years ago defined white nationalism as America's greatest domestic terror threat, yet the Trump administration calls Antifa the most serious terrorist threat in the country, although no one can tell us where it's headquartered, who its leaders are, what its structure is, how many members it has, or what crimes it is responsible for committing. And meanwhile, the administration gutted the domestic terrorism operations section of the FBI, which monitored threats by violent groups including white nationalists. Trump invited Nicolas Fuentes, a vicious neo-Nazi and Holocaust denier, to Mar-a-Lago, and Trump said he saw very fine people on both sides of an anti-Semitic riot in Charlottesville, which is a confusion that has not afflicted prior presidents like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who knew exactly which side America needs to be on when Nazis are on the march. And that last bit is so devastating, because it reminds us that this isn't complicated. You don't need a PhD in political theory to understand that when Nazis march, you oppose them. You don't equivocate. You don't both sides it, you stand with the anti-fascists every single time. The financial warfare component of this is absolutely crucial to understand, because this is how you destroy civil society without needing to arrest everyone. You just cut off the money, and the memorandum authorizes and directs the Joint Terrorism Task Force to coordinate a comprehensive national strategy to investigate, prosecute, and disrupt not only individuals who engage in unlawful activity, but also institutional and individual funders and officers and employees of organizations. And in a fact sheet, the administration claims protected political speech, including speech comparing the administration's actions to fascism or Nazism, is directly responsible for domestic terrorism, which means literally saying, Trump's policies are fascistic, could now be construed as providing material support for terrorism, and get your nonprofit's tax-exempt status revoked or your bank account frozen. This is economic coercion in service of political conformity, and it's deeply un-American in every sense that matters. Think about the chilling effect this creates across every progressive organization in America right now, because the presidential memorandum has very broad language that tries to link ideologies, some that are ill-defined ideologies like anti-capitalism or anti-Christianity, without evidence to violent conduct, and the impact is that it will chill advocacy and tries to silence dissent. And when you're running a small nonprofit focused on immigrant rights or climate justice or racial equity, you're now looking over your shoulder wondering if accepting a grant from a progressive foundation is going to get you investigated by a joint terrorism task force, and that's exactly the point, that's exactly what this is designed to do. The Trump administration's attacks on civil society threaten the rights of all Americans, requiring a broad and active defense of those rights, and while today the target may be one particular group, or those perceived to be part of one particular political ideology, the next day it could just as easily be you or me. And without civil society and the stability and protection these organizations provide to counter creeping authoritarianism and right-wing propaganda, all of our rights are at risk. And this is the crucial insight, because authoritarian repression always starts with the most marginalized and most vocal opponents, but it never stops there. It metastasizes until it consumes everyone who isn't actively collaborating. Let's be very specific about the legal architecture being constructed here, because the memorandum emphasizes crimes such as assaulting federal officers, conspiracy, money laundering, funding terrorist acts, arson, racketeering, and major fraud, and agencies are directed to apply strategies from efforts to disrupt violent and organized crime networks, with Treasury instructed to devote all available resources to identifying and disrupting financial networks funding domestic terrorism, tracing illicit funding streams, while the IRS is directed to ensure that no tax-exempt entities, directly or indirectly, finance political violence or domestic terrorism, referring violators to DOJ for potential prosecution, which means they're going to use RICO statutes and money laundering laws and every tool developed to fight the mafia and drug cartels against organizations whose crime is advocating for social justice. And this is how you build a police state. You take counterterrorism infrastructure built for external threats, and you turn it on your own citizens engaging in constitutionally protected political activity. And here's the truly Kafkaesque element, because there is no legal mechanism to make domestic terror designations under federal law, unlike the framework that exists for foreign terrorist organizations, meaning such designations carry no automatic legal consequences, but it may serve as a policy directive to federal agencies to use existing law as a political weapon against groups that disagree with the president. So the designation is legally meaningless, but operationally devastating, because it signals to every federal prosecutor and FBI agent and IRS auditor that these organizations are now legitimate targets, and if you want to advance your career, you'll find reasons to investigate them, and this is how bureaucratic authoritarianism functions in practice. The memo itself might not create new crimes, but it creates new priorities, and new resources, and new political will to weaponize existing laws against political enemies, and that's more than enough. What Raskin is identifying here with laser precision is that the Trump Justice Department seeks to redefine any kind of political dissent against him as domestic terrorism, and once you accept that framework, once you allow the state to criminalize opposition to state power, then you no longer have a democracy, you have authoritarianism with democratic window dressing. This is the definitional move that matters more than any specific prosecution or investigation, because it reshapes the entire landscape of permissible politics, and it does so before any court can intervene. The damage occurs long before a case reaches the judiciary. Communities live under the threat of law enduring harassment, surveillance, and detention, and by the time the courts intervene, the order will have already succeeded in silencing voices and deterring resistance, which is why focusing solely on whether the courts will strike this down misses the entire authoritarian strategy at work. The Trump administration has been remarkably explicit about their targets too, which in some ways is almost refreshing compared to the usual political euphemisms, because, when asked what specific people or organizations the memo seeks to target, Trump named Soros, saying Soros is a name certainly that I keep hearing, I don't know. Soros is a name that I hear, and Trump asserted Soros must be jailed because he's a bad guy, while Vice President J.D. Vance baselessly claimed that Soros and the Open Society Foundations pay the salaries of terrorist sympathizers and promote violence and terrorism, which is anti-Semitic conspiracy theory stuff, straight from the far-right fever swamps, now emanating from the White House and the Vice President's office. They're not even hiding it anymore. They're just straight up saying we're going to use federal law enforcement to go after a Jewish philanthropist who funds progressive causes, and if you think that's not fascism, then I genuinely don't know what would qualify. The nonprofit community has responded with appropriate alarm, because more than 3,000 organizations signed a national solidarity letter opposing this, but the question is whether civil society has the resources and coordination to actually resist what's coming, because central to Trump's effort to dismantle left-wing terrorism, according to Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller, are joint terrorism task forces, which are FBI-operated task forces intended to work with state and local law enforcement agencies to conduct counterterrorism investigations, and there are around 200 JTTFs across the country, and at least 5 in New York State, but we know very little about what JTTFs do, what policies and rules they follow, what agencies or individuals they involve, what types of data they have access to, what information they share, and with whom, and what invasive surveillance technology they use, which means this repressive apparatus operates in almost total secrecy with virtually no public accountability, and it's about to be unleashed against American activists and organizers. Let me absolutely hammer this point home, because some people still seem to think this is normal political hardball or typical partisan fighting, but the U.S. is in an authoritarian political reality, where the Trump administration, Congress, and state governments have fully suspended international human rights, and are engaging in tactics of repression that are hallmarks of fascist regimes. And this is not a failure by the U.S. government to uphold rights. It is a calculated use of state power to punish political dissent, according to human rights organizations who've submitted reports to the United Nations documenting American authoritarianism. When international human rights groups are appealing to the UN about American civil liberties violations. We've crossed a pretty serious Rubicon, and the fact that this isn't leading every newscast every single night tells you how normalized creeping fascism has become in our media environment. The ideological elasticity of these designations is the feature that makes them so dangerous, because once you establish the principle that opposing the government's preferred policies on immigration or policing or capitalism makes you a potential terrorist, then any form of civil disobedience can now be cast as terrorism. Sit-ins, direct action against deportations, labor strikes, or even marches that block traffic can be swept under this expanded definition of criminality, and this is how you destroy the entire tradition of civil resistance that gave us the civil rights movement and the labor movement and every progressive advance in American history. Martin Luther King would be a domestic terrorist under this framework. The Freedom Riders would be domestic terrorists. The Stonewall protesters would be domestic terrorists. Anyone who ever engaged in civil disobedience against unjust state power would be retroactively criminalized, and that's not an accident, it's the entire point. What makes this moment particularly urgent is that Raskin said the FBI had 70 active Antifa-related investigations and reported a 171% increase in related arrests this year. Which means this isn't hypothetical threat, this is operational reality right now. There are dozens of investigations underway, and arrests are skyrocketing, and we need to be asking who exactly is being arrested, and what exactly they're being charged with, because I guarantee you, it's not people plotting actual violence, it's people who showed up to protests, or donated to the wrong organization, or said the wrong thing online, and are now being swept up in a domestic counter-terrorism operation aimed at criminalizing dissent. The bureaucratic machinery is already grinding people up as we speak, while we debate whether this is really authoritarianism or just politics. Raskin's invocation of Orwell here is so perfectly calibrated because this is a classic Orwellian and authoritarian tactic that anybody who loves freedom should reject. And what makes it Orwellian specifically is not just the lying which is ubiquitous in politics, but the inversion of meaning itself, where anti-fascism becomes fascism, where opposition to authoritarianism becomes the real authoritarianism, where up is down, and war is peace, and freedom is slavery. Orwell understood that totalitarian control requires controlling not just behavior, but language itself, controlling the very categories through which we understand political reality, and that's exactly what Trump is attempting when he designates anti-fascism as terrorism. He's trying to make it literally impossible to articulate opposition to his authoritarian project without being labeled an extremist. And that's a form of epistemic violence that prefigures and enables physical violence. The comparative authoritarian dimension here is crucial too, because in Turkey, the government weaponized legal tools, such as the anti-defamation law, to stifle dissent, criminalizing insulting Turkishness as a powerful instrument of state control, undermining free speech and academic freedom, while fostering a climate of mistrust and self-censorship, and hundreds of academics, including those prosecuted for signing the peace petition, have faced mass arrests and show trials, while more than 5,800 academics have been dismissed from public universities under emergency decrees, often under the pretext of having ties to terrorist organizations. And if you don't see the direct parallel to what Trump is doing with Antifa designations and nonprofit targeting, then you're willfully blind because this is the exact same playbook. Erdogan designated a decentralized opposition movement as terrorism and used that to purge academia and civil society and the judiciary, and Trump is doing the identical thing just with American characteristics and better PR. We need to be crystal clear about what the endgame is here, because the irony should not be lost that a self-proclaimed defender of law and order has issued an order condemning anti-fascist politics while excusing fascist violence, and at its core, this Antifa order is undemocratic and unconstitutional. But even if it never survives legal scrutiny, it will have served its purpose to intimidate, divide, and delegitimize dissent. And this is why the conventional liberal response of just trusting the courts is catastrophically pretty inadequate, because by the time the courts act, if they act, the political culture will have already been transformed, the organizations will have already been bankrupted, the activists will have already been arrested, the files will have already been compiled, and the precedent will have been set that the federal government can designate its political opponents as terrorists. You can't just litigate your way out of fascism. The resistance has to be political and social, and it has to happen now, not after the courts weigh in 3 years from now. Raskin is doing something absolutely vital in this clip, which is using his institutional position and his command of constitutional law to speak truth about what's happening in language that cannot be dismissed as mere partisan rancor, because Raskin's job as the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee is to challenge Republicans to stand with Democrats to uphold the rule of law at a very dangerous moment in American history, as Trump is upending constitutional norms and congressional powers with Republicans more united behind him than ever before. And he's explicitly framing this as a constitutional crisis, not a policy disagreement. When a constitutional law professor and ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee tells you that the executive branch is engaging in authoritarian tactics that anybody who loves freedom should reject, you need to understand that's not hyperbole. That's a sober assessment from someone who understands exactly how democracies collapse, and we are watching it happen in real time with receipts and testimony and documented evidence. The financial targeting component deserves special emphasis because it's less visible than arrests but potentially more destructive to civil society. More than 350 organizations wrote that the executive branch could use this authority to target its political opponents and use the fear of crippling legal fees, the stigma of the designation, and donors fleeing controversy to stifle dissent and chill speech and advocacy. And while the broadest applications of this authority may not ultimately hold up in court, the potential reputational and financial cost of fending off an investigation and litigating a wrongful designation could functionally mean the end of a targeted nonprofit before it ever has its day in court, which is process as punishment, which is how you destroy organizations without needing to convict them of anything. You just investigate them and audit them and designate them, and even if they're ultimately vindicated, they're broke and discredited and defunct, and the chilling effect on other organizations is devastating because everyone learns the lesson that challenging power is existentially dangerous. Look at what Thompson exposed in that hearing, because this wasn't some gotcha moment about a minor policy detail. This was a fundamental exposure of the entire fraud at the heart of Trump's domestic counterterrorism strategy. While the operations director of the FBI's National Security Branch sees Antifa as the nation's most immediate violent threat, he couldn't say literally anything of substance about its location or membership after months of investigation, and Thompson told Raskin, "Sir, you wouldn't come to this committee to say something that you can't prove. I know you wouldn't do that, but you did, and this was embarrassing, but unsurprising, because everyone involved knows this is a political operation, not a counter-terrorism operation, but the FBI is going along with it, because that's what bureaucracies do under authoritarian pressure. They comply. They find ways to justify the unjustifiable. They generate the intelligence products that the political leadership demands, regardless of whether those products correspond to reality. And this is where we have to talk about complicity, because Thursday's hearing made it quite clear that Raskin, a career FBI official who has worked under multiple presidents, knows all of that, and the question is how far the rest of the federal government is willing to take that lie, which cuts to the heart of how authoritarianism actually functions in practice, because you don't need every government employee to be a true believer. You just need them to be careerists who will go along to get along, who will implement directives they know are wrong, because that's what the chain of command demands, and because resigning on principle is hard when you have a mortgage and kids in college. This is Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, playing out in congressional testimony, the bureaucratization of authoritarianism, where people who probably consider themselves patriots and professionals participate in the construction of a surveillance state apparatus aimed at criminalizing political dissent. The international dimension matters too, because human rights organizations have published a report urging the United Nations to denounce the accelerated disintegration of democracy in the U.S., with a focus on the government's increasing criminalization and repression of free speech, dissent, and protest under the guise of national security, which is scheduled for formal review in November as part of the Universal Periodic Review process, highlighting specific U.S. violations of international human rights law related to the weaponization of the national security and terrorism frameworks, as well as the vast surveillance apparatus used to repress freedom of expression and stifle dissent. And this is genuinely unprecedented for the United States to be the subject of this kind of international human rights scrutiny about domestic political repression. We've become the kind of country that files reports with the UN about other countries' human rights violations, and now we're the country being reported on, and that should shake us out of any remaining complacency that this is just normal democratic politics. What Raskin is articulating, and what we need to amplify and organize around, is that we must hold a hearing on the Trump administration's attempt to criminalize political dissent in the country. But Republicans won't allow that hearing because they're complicit in the authoritarianism. They're not innocent bystanders. They're active participants in the criminalization of dissent and the destruction of civil society, and they're doing it because they understand that demographic and ideological trends are against them, and that the only way they can maintain power long-term is through increasingly authoritarian means. This is minority rule entrenching itself through the weaponization of state power, and it's happening with remarkable speed and remarkably little effective resistance from the institutions that are supposed to serve as democratic guardrails. The bottom line is this, and there's no way to sugarcoat it, because the stakes are too high, and the hour is too late. We are watching the construction of an authoritarian state apparatus in the United States designed to criminalize political opposition and destroy civil society, and it's being done under the pretext of counterterrorism, but the real target is democracy itself. When the FBI can't explain what Antifa is, or where it exists, or who leads it, but declares it the #1 domestic threat, and when the president issues executive orders and presidential memoranda designated decentralized ideological opposition as terrorism, and when the Attorney General orders the compilation of lists of organizations and individuals engaged in protected political speech, and when joint terrorism task forces are directed to investigate the funders of progressive causes, and when the IRS is weaponized to strip tax-exempt status from non-profit organizations that oppose administration policies, and when all of this is justified through a sprawling conspiracy theory that paints anti-fascism as the real fascism, then you don't have a democracy anymore. You have authoritarianism with elections, and the elections are the next thing they'll come for. Raskin is right to invoke Orwell, and he's right to call this what it is, which is authoritarian, and he's right to say that anybody who loves freedom should reject it. But rejection isn't enough. We need mass mobilization. We need civil society organizations to stand in solidarity with each other. We need legal defense funds and rapid response networks and sustained public pressure. And most of all, we need people to understand that this isn't about Antifa. This isn't about one particular movement or organization or protest. This is about whether the United States government can designate its political opponents as terrorists and use the full force of the national security state to destroy them. And if we allow that precedent to be established, then everything else is just a matter of time. The authoritarianism you allow against your perceived enemies will eventually be turned on you and your causes and your communities, and by then it will be too late to build the resistance networks that could have stopped it. The moment to act is now. The threat is real, and the stakes are democracy itself. And I'm not being dramatic, I'm being precise, based on every piece of evidence we have about what Trump is doing, and what his officials are saying, and what the FBI is implementing. And if you're not alarmed by what you just watched in that clip, then you haven't understood what you're seeing, which is American fascism being normalized through bureaucratic procedure and congressional testimony, and that should terrify you into action.